Hey guys, my name is Trevor Sullivan. I'm a solutions architect with Stratus Grid, and welcome back to our video channel. Thanks so much for joining us for another video. And what we're going to talk about in this video is how to use the conditional node inside of your Amazon Bedrock prompt flows. Now, we already have a couple of other videos on Amazon Bedrock prompt flows. This is actually a preview feature that's been available since July 10th of 2024. It's still in preview as of this particular video. So there are some bugs to flush out and things like that, but the conditional node does work at least at a basic level. So we're going to kind of explore how you can utilize that inside of a relatively simple prompt flow. Now, before we drill into today's topic, I did want to just briefly talk about Stratus Grid. So we are an AWS Premier Consulting partner. We're also an ISV or independent software vendor, and we provide a FinOps and SecOps solution called Stratosphere. Stratosphere helps you to cost optimize in the cloud and monitor your spend, monitor potential savings and discounts that are being applied across your entire AWS environment, whether that's an AWS organization or even multiple AWS organizations. And it's specifically designed for large enterprises and private equity firms. So if you're interested in talking about Stratosphere or seeing a demonstration of how Stratosphere works, feel free to hit the link to book a demo up here, and we would love to chat with you. So let's go ahead and switch over to today's topic, which is going to be the conditional node in the Bedrock prompt flows. Now, the first thing I'm going to look at here is actually the documentation for Amazon Bedrock. If you scroll down to the section that talks about prompt flows right here, and then open up the how it works section here, we've referred to in our previous videos the node types section here. So there's a bunch of different types of nodes that you can drag and drop and connect together or kind of wire up together on your prompt flows. And one of those different node types that we can use is called the conditional node. So, or just condition node, I guess, in this case. So what the condition node does is it takes some kind of input, and then based on certain expressions that are evaluated during the execution of that prompt flow, there are different routes that the conditional node can take to continue execution of the prompt flow. Now, the Amazon documentation here for Bedrock does include, if you go to example prompt flows, it's pretty lightweight on the examples right now. They don't have a whole bunch of complex examples, but they do have a relatively simple example of how to use a conditional node. Unfortunately, there are some limitations with it that I've found, like taking input. It's just a little bit more limited as far as how you can specify inputs here. You can't really take like a JSON string and then turn it into an actual object that you can interpret. So they have some more work to do, I think, on features like that, but at least they do demonstrate how to utilize it at a basic level. Now, what you'll notice from the documentation, and I realize that this screenshot probably is a little bit on the small side just because it's kind of zoomed out and I'm screen recording it at the same time. So the flow input here is actually going to be a JSON object. So when we feed some kind of input into the execution of the prompt flow, we're actually going to declare that as a JSON input. In some of the other examples that I've done, I've actually just used more of a natural language approach, like where we did code benchmarking and actually generated code samples in Python and JavaScript. That's more of a natural language approach where I give the LLM some kind of task that I want it to perform. But when we're using the conditional node, we need to feed in some kind of structured data so that we can parse individual fields out of that JSON object so that we can perform comparisons against those individual string or numeric values. So it is a little bit more limited in that regard, but just keep in mind that when we feed some input in this time, we're going to be using an object type of input as our flow input rather than just a string input type that we've used before, and that's the default value for the flow input. So what we can do is take a look over here at the node types, open up the conditional node here, and this is going to talk about some of the different supported operators here. In the future, it would be great to see some additional operators. So these are conjunctions here where you can kind of combine together multiple expressions. But as far as the individual expressions that you're building, the individual comparisons that you're building against different values, you have equals or not equals for string, number, and Boolean types here. But then for numeric types, you also have, greater than or equal to, less than or equal to as well. But in the future, it would be really great to have things like array operators where you could have a contains or not contains function to check if an array contains a certain string value or contains a certain numeric or certain Boolean value or something of that nature. It would just be nice to have some more advanced features here. Also, another type of operator that I would love to see supported in here is a like operator so that you can do some kind of string regular expression matching or at least basic wildcard comparisons as well. So right now we're just pretty limited as far as what operators we currently have. But again, this is in preview, and so hopefully they'll expand on these supported operators in the future. So what we're going to do is just build a really simple example here. And so let's head over to the AWS Management Console, and we're going to choose one of the supported regions for the preview, which are listed right here in the preview announcement from July 10th. So I'm in the US West to Oregon region right up here, and I'm going to open up the Bedrock console. Also, the reason that I have the light color theme here with a white background is because there's actually a bug in the prompt flow editor interface where if I apply the dark theme to the console, which is typically what I prefer, you actually can't see the text for the comparison expressions that you build inside of the conditional node specifically. So for this particular video, unfortunately, we just have to choose the light mode here. So what we're going to do now is head over to Builder Tools, go down to Prompt Flows right here. And what we're going to do is just create a new prompt flow. So I'm going to hit this button right here to create a prompt flow. And we're going to call this Trevor SG Test Conditional Node. And I'll just give it a description like testing the conditional node type for a YouTube video, and then I'll just choose to create a new IAM execution role for this prompt flow, and then we'll just hit this create button right down here to create the new flow. Now, typically, when you get this kind of complex screen here, you can just minimize the left-hand sidebar there because we don't really need that when we are actively editing. And as we're editing, we also don't need the test pane over on the far right. So we'll go ahead and remove that for now. We'll close that notification up there just to open up our screen a little bit. And if you would like to zoom in and out from the flow nodes right here, you can actually just hold the control key on your keyboard and use the mouse scroll wheel to zoom in and out on different parts of your flow. And you can just left click and drag around to kind of move the canvas around as you're making edits to your prompt flow. In the future, it'd be nice if they also made this minimizable up here so that you could just kind of expand your screen utilization a little bit higher as well. This heading here kind of takes up a bunch of screen real estate at the moment, but hopefully they could kind of consolidate that and crunch it down to a single line in the future. So, that's feedback that if you're using this feature and you have direct access to a solutions architect or an account team at AWS, you might want to share that feedback with them as well as they continue to iterate on this feature. All right, so what we're going to do is go over to nodes right here. And so we've got this logic section here. There's 3 different types of nodes, the collector, condition, and iterator. We're just going to bring in the condition node for now and explore a little bit more how it works. Now, what you're going to notice is that the italicized text inside the condition node. If I switch the color theme over to dark, and we fill out some kind of text for the actual condition, you can actually see that that text disappears as I am typing it there. But as soon as we switch back over to the light theme, that text actually does show up properly. So again, that's why I'm using the light theme in this particular case. So what we're going to do, if you recall, when we were looking at the screenshot from the documentation, the default type of the flow input here is just a flat string value. So normally you would come over to test prompt flow right here, and you might say something like, generate a Python script that, does something, right? And so this is the input string that's fed into this flow input node here. But this time, because we are working with the conditional node right here, what we're going to do instead is actually input a string, but it's actually going to be formatted as a proper JSON string so that the flow engine that's actually executing these prompt flows can interpret that JSON string, and then we can actually parse out individual properties and values from that JSON object when we go over to the conditional node. So what I'm going to use as kind of a contrived example here is, let's say that we're processing different types of accounts in some kind of order processing system. So if I just open up a notepad right here, I'm going to have a couple of different JSON structures that I'll pass in. So the first one will be account type is consumer. And then if it's a consumer, then it's going to have a consumer name property here. And this could be, Trevor Sullivan, for example. And then I'm going to take off that extra comma because I'm not sure if it'll parse that properly or not. But then what I'm going to do is just copy and paste this down here. But then the other type of account that we could have could be a business account, right? So we have B2B and we've got B2C business. And if I pass in a B2C, I want to have an account type of consumer. If I do B2B transactions, then I want to have an account type of business. But if it's a business account type, then I'm going to have a business name instead of a consumer name field, right? So depending on what the value of the account type property is, that's going to change the overall JSON structure of this message. And it's going to kind of change the output that I'm expecting from this input that we're feeding in. So these are kind of two different types of payloads. And then of course, we always have kind of an exception condition, like what happens if it doesn't match any of these conditions? Well, we're going to have an exception where we say account type is, unsupported. We could really put any value that we want right here, like blah, but I'm just going to say unsupported for now and just kind of leave it at that. We don't really care what these other properties are. So we'll, just go ahead and just get rid of that. And so these are going to be the three different payloads that we're going to test with. So let me just put some extra space in there so we don't accidentally copy any extra lines there. Okay. So what we're going to do for starters is go to this flow input here. And instead of just making it a flat string, we're going to say that the input that we feed into the test is going to be an object type. And then what we're going to do is wire up that flow input over into the conditional node here. Now, the conditional node is going to have this extraction capability where we can actually extract individual values out of the object that's being passed as input to the conditional node. So again, if we take a look at the documentation for Bedrock prompt flows and look at the conditional node example here, you can see that the flow input is taking an object as its input, and then it's spitting that out into the conditional node. But the conditional node is actually declaring three different fields or three different properties as inputs. There's a retail price as a number, a market price as a number, and then a type as a string. So what we're actually doing is using this feature here called expressions to extract specific bits of data from this JSON payload or object that's being fed into the conditional node. Normally, the entire input would just be a dollar data here, so that kind of represents the entire input. But what we're actually going to do is extract a named field based off of the property name. So we're going to say, I want to create an account type property on the conditional node, and I want it to extract the value of the account type field that's being passed in to the input of the actual node itself. So hopefully that makes sense as we work through things here a little bit more. So what we're going to do is define an account type as an input here. So under input section here, we're going to say account type. Sometimes the keyboard doesn't finish typing here in this editor for some reason. But then what we're going to do down here for the expression is to say dot. So $.data is the entire JSON payload, but then we can just say dot or period, and then account type. And there's that weird text entry thing happening again. So then what we're going to do is we're going to extract the value of the account type field or property here from the JSON payload, and we're going to map that to the account type input here. So now inside of these condition values that we have right down here, these comparison expressions that we're crafting, we can now use this account type field as a named field inside of these conditional nodes here. So that's how we extract something from this object input to the flow, and then bring it into the conditional node, and then extract those individual property values. So now under the condition here, we can add a couple of conditions. So we're going to have one condition for consumer type accounts. We're going to have one condition for business type accounts. And then we're going to have an exception, or if it's anything else, it's like if this, or else do this, right? And so what we're going to do for the conditions here is say that if the account type is equal to consumer, then we want to do something, right? And the way that we know this operator here, again, is from the documentation where it talks about the node types here. We had this table down here where we have the double equals to indicate string equality, or we have exclamation equals to say not equal for string values. That's how we're doing the comparison condition expressions here for the account type input. So now I'm just going to copy this and then bring it down here, and I'll just call this condition underscore business. And up here, I'll call this condition underscore consumer. And then for the business condition, all I'm going to do is change the value that we're comparing against to business instead. And then down here under the else, we don't have to specify any comparison here because it's a catch-all. So if neither of these conditions up here match, then the exception condition will be triggered and go off and do something else. So that's how we do the basic setup here. The only other thing that we really have to do here is to map the flow of these different conditions. So now you can see we've got these purple nodes right here, or purple outputs, I should say, on the conditional node. And so what these do, unlike the blue circles that we have here, those blue connection points, the blue connection points actually pass data between different nodes. So if you see a blue circle, that's taking the output of one node and it's feeding it to the input of another node. But when you see these purple circles or purple connectors on a conditional node here, that's actually indicating the flow control of the Bedrock prompt flow. So what we can do is have like 3 different outputs here, right? And again, refer back to the example flow that they have right here. You can see that they have a single input with an object. They map that to a few different properties. There's a couple of different conditions here, and then they have 3 different output nodes depending on which condition is actually met, right? So what I'm going to do is bring in a couple of additional flow output nodes here, because you can have multiple outputs that are all triggered simultaneously, or you could just have one that's triggered depending on a conditional statement. And what I'm going to do is wire everything up, but I'm going to give them names first. So the bottommost one, I'm going to go call flow output exception. The next one, I'm going to call it flow output business. And then the upper one, I'm going to call it flow output consumer. Now, remember that our payloads are different here. So if the account type is consumer, then we have a consumer name property. If the account type is business, then we have a business name property, but we don't have a consumer name property, right? And if it's account type unsupported, then we just don't really care. So what we're going to do is on the flow output consumer here, we're going to extract from the total input that's coming into the flow output consumer node, which is actually going to come from over here, right? Because we don't actually pass the data from the conditional. The conditional only controls the flow of which nodes are triggered next. So in order to have the data actually flow from the flow input to the flow output, we actually have to feed that straight in, or we could put some other intermediate steps in here as well. But they have a lot more work to do on that before those types of more advanced situations are supported. But now what we can do is just drag and drop and say, okay, if the conditional consumer is met, then we're going to go to flow output consumer. If the account type is business, we're going to go up to the flow output business. And if it's an exception condition, an else condition, then we're going to go up to flow output exception, right? So this is kind of how our control flow looks. But again, the actual data itself is being fed directly from the output here into each of those nodes. The conditional node is only controlling the actual flow execution, like which node is going to get triggered next and which ones are not going to get triggered. So what we can do now is go to each of these flow output nodes and we can extract individual fields from the flow input. And because the JSON schema is going to change depending on which type of object we have here. So if we have an account type consumer, we have a consumer name property, but we don't have business name property. If we have the account type business, we have the business name property, but not consumer name. And because we're using the conditional node to control which of these flow output nodes are actually invoked, we can have different JSON schemas for each of these. So if the output type is consumer, then I want to grab $.data, that's the entire input payload, and then say dot consumer name, and that will extract just the consumer name from the input. But if it's a business type, that consumer name property doesn't exist, but that's okay because the conditional node is preventing this consumer node from getting triggered if the account type is business instead. So we're not going to get an error complaining that the business object doesn't have a consumer name property because this node is never going to get triggered in that condition. Same thing for the flow output business here. We want to have a business name property extracted from that payload. So we'll say dot business name. And then finally, for the flow output exception here, we're just going to take the entire payload because if it's an exception condition like that, then we need to be able to inspect that payload and do something with it so that we can figure out what went wrong inside of our system here. All right, so now we've set up everything here. We've set our output to our inputs. We've set our control flow nodes up down here. So I think we're just about at the point where we can test things out. So if you click on the save button, we should get a little green box up here indicating that the save was successful. And now we are ready to actually test out this prompt flow to see if it works or not. So let's go ahead and give it a try with these sample payloads that we have right over here. So for starters, I'm going to go ahead and just copy this consumer account type right here, and we'll paste it into test prompt flow here and hit run. And it looks like we have an error here. And so the error is actually occurring because we changed the flow input right up here to be an output type of object. So whatever we're feeding in is going to be a JSON object, but when we added the flow nodes, the flow output nodes, I should say, down here, we left the default input as string types. So we actually have to change that input to an object because we're taking that entire JSON object that we feed into the flow input, and we're actually sending it directly to the flow output. So it's not just a flat string value, it's actually a complex JSON object. So we just have to change the input on each of these output nodes. I know that's kind of confusing to say, but the input side of the output nodes is actually going to be a type object instead. So let's go ahead and save this once again. It would actually kind of be nice if they validated that when they saved it rather than when they tested it. Otherwise, it can be a little bit deceiving that it saves successfully. Okay, so let's go ahead and paste this in once again. So we've got account type consumer, consumer name Trevor Sullivan. So now it should properly parse that as a JSON object, and it looks like we don't have that here. So it says that the flow output consumer was expected to be an object, and it's actually string. So let's actually go back and look at the documentation here. So it does look like they actually used a string as the type here, not object. So let's maybe actually change this back really quickly here. We're going to change this back to string for each of these output nodes. And then what I want to do is save this, and then I want to re-invoke it again to see if we can figure out what the original error message was that we got when we did this. And so this time we get an error saying that the connection from the input node to flow output node 0 has an incompatible type. And I actually think I see what's happening right here. So if we look very, very closely at this error message right here, so anytime that you run into an error like this, you really want to break the error down into the most specific nodes that are being affected. And so what we have here, it's saying that flow input node 0, and we only have the one flow input node right up here, has a connection to flow output node exception, right? So that's talking about this exception flow output node right down here. And what I just remembered is that on the flow outputs for consumer and business right here, we are actually referencing a specific property on a JSON object. So we're expecting that these two nodes up here for consumer and business are going to interpret the payload as a JSON object and then extract just one field value out of that JSON object. However, the difference here is that with the flow output exception, what we're doing here is we're actually taking the entire JSON string from the flow input node, and we're actually taking that entire JSON string. We're not parsing it or anything. We're not looking for a specific field because we're just doing $.data. That refers to the entire payload. And so I think what it's saying here is that it's actually expecting this to be an object input type here. Whereas these ones here are string input types because we are referencing a specific property. So in these cases, it's going to be string. And then in the last case here, it's going to be object. So let's go ahead and try that out really quick and see what we get. So we'll save this flow once again, and then let's just copy our test input here and run it again. And as you can see, it's working just fine this time. I'm not sure if they have that in the documentation here. It looks like their example might be a little bit different because in their documentation, they actually have the exception node having, or the else node, whatever you want to call it, that actually has a string input type. So they might be doing things a little bit differently where they're extracting a value from the flow output node. But in our example case here, we're actually just taking the entire JSON object as output and then feeding it as input to the flow output node here. All right, so again, we're just going to test this out really quick. So if it's a consumer account type, then we extract the consumer name, which is Trevor Sullivan, and that's coming from flow output consumer, which is this node right here. Now, if we try a different payload, let's try the business payload right down here. Actually, before we do that, I just want to test this out really quick, but change the name to something else like Chris Hurst, just to kind of prove that that's working. And sure enough, that works fine. Let's click the little icon to sweep up our results there. Then we'll try the business right here. So let's copy these lines and paste that in as well. And as you can see, the business name, it is parsed correctly there. Let's actually try a business like Acme Corp or something like that that's fictional, and we'll go ahead and run that, and sure enough, Acme Corp is extracted there. And again, this works because the nodes here that are referencing properties that are invalid, like consumer name, when we pass in a business, are not getting executed, and so therefore they're not throwing any kind of error complaining that there's not a consumer name property because the condition node here is not allowing them to be executed based on the conditions that we specified right inside of this condition node. So let's try the final example, which is where the account type is not equal to business and it's not equal to consumer. So let's copy this here and we'll paste that in. And as you can see, all it does is it spits out the exact same thing. So this is our input right here. And then the flow output exception simply took that entire JSON object and it just spit it right back out to us. So the only condition that could potentially cause an error would be if we didn't have an account type field at all, because again, our condition node right here is expecting that we're going to have an account type. So another example that we could create here would be a situation where maybe it's called capital A account type instead of lowercase a, and I'm pretty sure that this is case sensitive here. So if we were to test this out with account type with a capital A instead of a lowercase a, we're probably going to get an error here saying, hey, I can't even find the account type property on the input that you passed in. So this is kind of a fourth condition where we'll actually get an error on the condition node because the condition node input here is mapping specifically to an account type property that starts with a lowercase a. And if we don't pass in that JSON property as input to the prompt flow, then it's going to throw an error. So feel free to play around with this feature yourself. Go ahead and open up the Bedrock console, go to one of the supported regions for the prompt flows feature, and then create your own flow and play around with these criteria a little bit if you'd like to. You can also have more complex inputs here. So instead of just having like account type and business name, we could have, total sales or something like that and make that some kind of numeric value, like maybe 5,000, for example. And then we could actually add that as an additional parsed field as input on the condition node here. So if we try this out, it should work because we have an account type here that's supported by the conditional node. So let's go ahead and just run that. And sure enough, that works because we're not actually doing anything with total sales. So as far as the conditional node is concerned, it doesn't really care. But what we can actually do is go onto this conditional node and say, hey, I want to add a second input that could potentially be used inside of these conditional expressions, right? And so what we could do is say, well, the second condition is going to be total sales. And I'm going to use all lowercase here just to differentiate it from the actual input, which has a capital S for sales here. And so what we're going to do is say total sales is actually a numeric value. And then I'm going to say, in order to extract the total sales value, which is in this case 5,000 in the example input, I want to do $.data.total sales. And that will allow me to now use total sales from here as input. And that could actually come from a different data source technically, but in this case, we're just feeding our input from this flow input node. So of course, that's where it's going to be able to extract that total sales number from. So let's go ahead and save this example here once again, make sure we get the green there to show that it's working. And then we'll copy this little example right here again and paste it in and hit run. And you can see it still works fine. But in this case, we've extracted total sales as a potential input, but we haven't actually used it anywhere in the condition expressions themselves. So what we can do is actually create compound expressions. So if we go back and look at node types here, go down to the condition node documentation. These are the condition expression operators that we have, the comparison operators. But if you want to create a compound expression, you can actually say and then you can pass in some additional criteria here. So what we want to do is actually put parentheses around each of the individual comparison expressions, and then use the and keyword to combine them together into a compound expression. So back here, if we wanted to, we could say, hey, if it's an account type of business and sales are greater than, a certain amount. So let's say, and total sales is greater than, let's say 3,000, whatever units you want to use, like US dollars. That will take both of those criteria and pass them along. Otherwise, it'll be considered an exception condition. So let's go ahead and try this out with a compound expression here. And because our total sales in this example input payload here are greater than 3,000, this should extract just the business name from the input payload. And sure enough, that's exactly what it does. However, if we paste in the same thing, but we change the input to be something like maybe 2,500, which is less than 3,000 that we have here in our expression or comparison expression. Let's go ahead and run that. And now you can see that the exception node is executed because consumer was not matched because that would have required that the account type is consumer. The business node didn't match because that requires that it's account type business and the total sales has to be greater than 3,000. But what happened in this case is that the exception case was handled because there were no additional conditions to compare against. And so it just went to the exception condition and it executed this node down here. So that's an example of how you can use the compound expressions to achieve these types of comparisons in a more complex type of conditional node right here. So anyways, I'd encourage you to go play around with this feature in your AWS account, get some hands-on time with it, learn what the different error messages mean and how to kind of work around those. And then once they eventually come out with the release version of this feature, hopefully there'll be a lot more comparison operators or even functions that you can use to compare different array values or object expressions with inside of the actual conditional node itself. And hopefully they'll have a little bit more flexibility with the different types that you can pass as input into the conditional node as well. Because right now you can't just take like a flat string value and then pass it in. And it just makes things a little bit confusing to wire up here, especially when you start to add some of the prompt nodes in here as well. So if you go to prompt nodes, the prompt node, for example, does not allow you to output an object type. So if we say, go down to the output section right here, I don't even have the option to output just like a JSON blob from a large language model. So unfortunately, that flexibility doesn't exist where I can take the output from a prompt node here and then feed it as a JSON payload as input here. I can only really do that as far as I know from the flow input type here. So hopefully they'll expand this feature in the future to have a little bit more flexibility in how we build things out here. But I'd encourage you to play around with it at least for now, just so you know how it works in practice right now. And then as those incremental features are added in the future for the official release of, or GA of this feature, then you'll know how the feature works already and you can just continue to build on that. So thanks so much for joining us for another video on prompt flows. Please like this video, subscribe to the channel so that you can get notified about future videos. We actually have a lot of great content on our YouTube channel. So if you head over to youtube.com/, go forth in cloud, or just click on our channel identifier under this video, you can check out all of our great videos on Bedrock prompt flows and S3 and Rust programming with Amazon S3 APIs and all this really interesting stuff here. So definitely check out our YouTube channel and feel free to leave a comment and let us know what you thought of this video and if there's any ways that we can help out your business with cloud consulting work. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next video. Take care.